how our observations can be a real teacher in our lives, and we can learn a lot from observing. So I got the opportunity to be on a train, which is something I do on the subway in Atlanta. And I was observing the rush of people going in and out of the trains and how people mingle with unknown people and strangers. And there was a group of kids, they were having a very nice discussion. And they were talking about where they went, what they did. And one of the kids explained that he went to the Disney World. And another kid said, "No, you didn't." And the kid said, "Yes, I did." And the kid said, "No, you didn't." And he said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Prove it." And the kid is like, "I'm telling you, I went." He said, "No, prove it." And the kid said, You want me to ask my mom and she tell you that I went?" And he said, "No, you prove it. I need picture proof." So this is something that really uh, something inside of me rung a bell, that we live in a society nowadays that we need to see in order to believe. They say that seeing is believing. And these little kids, they were talking and they need picture proof. If there is no picture proof, then, didn't happen. So I thought that was very interesting. And that got me into thinking how we live in a society today where we want to see the world with our senses. And not only with our senses, but we think that unless it's visible to our eyes, then it must not exist. It has to be seen in order uh, to bring out our faith in a particular thing or an idea or a person. It has to be visible to the eyes. Then I started to meditate on this topic, and this is what I've come up with from inside after making sure that my thoughts are in line with the wisdom texts of the Gita and other Vedic texts. So, how is it that if we cannot see something, it's hard for us to believe? And you may also notice that you also always want to see. And that's why social media is very powerful, because they continuously give you so many objects to see, so many places to see. Every second you can see people's in different places posting, and we are always glued to the screen to get an idea of the places, and then we start to develop ideas and desires in our hearts, places to visit, people to see, and our idea of what the reality is based on seeing with the eyes. But in the wisdom text, we learn that seeing through the eyes is going to be scratching the surface, that the real seeing happens through the ears. We actually have eyes in our ears, that if we really want to see, especially something that is uh, beyond what the eyes can see, you have to see through the ears. And for example, has anyone ever seen consciousness? If we ask, have you seen consciousness? Many people may be thinking that question is not very valid, because consciousness is not really visible to the eyes, but we can see consciousness to the symptoms of consciousness. For example, when our arms move, when the body is moving, all living entities, when there's life in the body, is different than when there's no consciousness in the body. So those are symptoms of someone who is not visible to the eyes, but exists. So in spiritual science, we understand that anything that we want to understand, the gateway to understanding the truth is through hearing. Now, I also want to explain that hearing and listening is different, but we're talking about hearing and how and why it's important to hear. Because hearing is a process that's mechanical, is involuntary process. You know, we perceive sounds through our ears, and listening is an active process of making sense of what you heard. So there is a difference. One is the mechanical process, one is an active process. So we're talking about the active process, which leads to you really, really diving deep into the principle of hearing. Sorry, principle of listening, because that's when you will start to make sense of what is it that you're hearing. So in the yoga text, we understand that if we want to hear and see the truth, we have to hear the truth. And for example, you know, those of all of you have gone to school, and the teacher teaches you there is a country named Zimbabwe, there's a country named Canada, there's a country, you know, Siberia, and we hear about all these countries, but we have never visited those countries. But because the teacher is teaching us, and the teacher is an authority in this subject, because that teacher has seen through his ears as well. And so he's able to impart that information to us. And therefore, we know that there's a country called Siberia, there's a country called Zimbabwe, there's a country called Timbuktu. I didn't even know Timbuktu was a country till someone actually told me Timbuktu is a country. So it's an interesting process of learning is, you know, we see through our ears. Another example I may give you, when I first came to the United States 21 years ago, I remember I drove a car, an old car, and my car broke down on the side of the Interstate 75. And I kind of panicked because I don't know what to do. So then I called a friend of mine, and I was trying to explain to him where I am, and he showed up with a mechanic. And the mechanic showed up on the spot, and he had these devices that he could see what was wrong with the car and everything. So he just plugged in some things, and I just waited, completely relieved that, you know, he was going to solve all my problems now. And he opened the hood. I could see the hood. He could see the hood. And he starts telling me that your gasket was leaking, and there was not enough power steering fluid, and blah, blah, blah. He gave a whole bunch of analysis of what was wrong. And I was thinking, I'm looking at the same car that you're looking at. How is it possible that you're seeing something that I'm not seeing? And the reason he's able to see what I'm not seeing is because he has heard. He has gone through the process of hearing for God knows how many years to be this expert mechanic, that he can just plug something in and the numbers, he knows exactly what those codes are, and he knows what to do with it, and it's very clear to him. For me, I was seeing the same thing, but I could not make sense of what was really happening. So this is something that is learned, again, a whole science that one learns through hearing, to see through the eyes of the ears. It's funny. And last year, I was in India after the trip I went to a hospital. I have a tendency when I'm in India to do a little physical checkup because it's a little less bureaucratic than where I live now. So I went to the hospital and they did blood work and they did x-rays and MRIs. And I looked at the x-ray, I could see the bones and I could see the x-ray, but I had no idea what was going on. When I looked at the MRI, I could see, the brain, the skull and like all kinds of dots in the screen, but I couldn't make any sense of it. And then when the doctor comes in, he looks at it, and then in no time, he tells me what's wrong, what's going on. How is that possible? It is because this doctor had actually spent time hearing. He probably spent 6, 7 years hearing about how the body works, how the bones work, how the brain works. Different doctors, of course. And they were very easily able to tell me what was going on. So this is the process. The process is to hear. And in the yoga philosophy wisdom, we understand how important to see the world through hearing. And very powerful because hearing is called Shruti in Sanskrit. And originally, all the wisdom texts were learned through hearing. That's why the wisdom texts are called Shruti, that which is learned through hearing. It is only later on, this great sage, Vyasadeva, he actually realized that people were not able to learn through hearing. And so therefore, he started to write. He started to document things for people. Is there anyone here who can learn from hearing, just by hearing? Learns everything? Wow, that's impressive. You all learn just by hearing. I need to read it, I need to write it, then I finally get it. So those that learn through hearing, just by hearing, they're called Shrutidhar. The Vedas were learned simply by hearing. They were not documented for the longest time. Only later on, they started to be documented. So the Vedas are divided, the wisdom texts are divided into two categories. One is Shruti, which is the wisdom texts that were learned by hearing. And then there's other texts which were learned by remembering. They're called Smritis. So all wisdom texts were through hearing or through remembering. So these are two principles to remember when we study wisdom text. Is this Shruti or Smriti? Because Smriti means someone's recollection of what they heard. And so that's why this hearing is what we're going to study. How is this hearing so potent and so powerful? Because hearing is the gateway to opening the doors of the heart. It is through hearing, when you hear something, then it'll go sink inside, you'll start to make sense of it, and you'll inquire more, and you'll start to make more sense of it. And eventually this hearing creates the pathway to your divine realizations, to realize the self. So hearing, in another sense, is the first step to spiritual enlightenment. And in yoga, you'll also hear this word commonly called darshan. Darshan means to see. So when people write their commentaries on something, it is called, like, for example, if I write a commentary on something, that will be called Veda Darshan. That means, Veda's documentation of Veda's hearing. What he has heard is then it's documented. So many, many sages, when they write, after they have heard from their teachers, these are called darshan, or to see with the ears, or the eyes of the ears and the eyes of the heart. So eyes of the ears leads you to the eyes of the heart, when you can actually see the world with a proper lens. And this hearing also is a big integral part of how our faith is developed. When we hear and then we absorb it and listen to what is happening and we try to make sense of it, and then faith is developed in the heart. So faith is the divine attribute, which is the innate nature of the consciousness that resides in this body. And that faith is developed through hearing. So another reason why it is very important to hear. It's almost like if you have any ignorance or illusion in the mind, then a doctor or a teacher, a spiritual guide, what they do is they give you an injection. Just like if something is wrong with your body, they give you an injection in your arm. So spiritual teachers, what they do is they give you an injection through the ears. And that injection is to remove the illusion around your heart so you can really, really see properly. So this is another reason why hearing is that powerful. Now, if you look at, in the material world, everything is made out of sound. Everything has a sound frequency. We are constantly hearing. And some people use that ability more than others. For example, many of you may know that Hitler, before he became Hitler, he used to go around in the restaurants and bars and give fiery speeches. And through his speeches, he was able to control and manipulate a whole nation. Imagine the power that he had just by speaking and people hearing him. They were mobilized, they were moved, and they just completely gave everything they had for whatever he believed in. It's because they heard. So the power of hearing is that it can move people to various different actions. It can be good, it can be not so good, and it can be extremely beneficial because it is the pathway to self-realization. So that's why hearing is a mystical process when we hear from a proper source and a proper authority. Just like a teacher. The teacher had heard for many years to be heard by the students. So people in the path of spirituality, I have spent approximately 40 years of my life just, of course, hearing my whole life, but 40 years of my life systematically hearing and absorbing and making sense of the spiritual subject matters. And as a result, I like to share that because it's been years of cultivating this pathway to the heart. So I will explain the story about my teacher. I have a teacher, his name is Jananivas. Some of you know. He just recently toured the US. He doesn't generally ever leave the sanctity of the spiritual sacred place where he lives in India. He is from the UK, and he was instructed by his teacher to spend his life cultivating this love in the heart, bhakti in the heart. And his twin brother spent 50 years without leaving and doing the same exact service nonstop. And I remember when he was my teacher and I was only a little, maybe 7, 8 years old. And I noticed that he would attend every single day the morning discussion on the Srimad Bhagavad Puran, one of the wisdom texts. And in the evening, he would also go and listen to the description of the other wisdom text called the Gita. There's many, but these were the two primary discussed morning and evening. And he would sit in on the class, and he did not even speak the language. It was very odd. The lectures or the discussion, the discourse was in a language that he didn't know a single word of, but he would still sit in and listen and hear. And I remember asking him, and I said, "Do you understand what they're saying?" He said, "I don't understand what they're saying, but I feel the vibration of the spiritual energy that is coming out from their heart." And I was like, what kind of a guy is this? And this was one of my teachers. And he's still alive. He's in his late 70s, 80s. He doesn't travel much anymore. So I thought it was very fascinating. The important principle was of hearing is something that is a big part of the practice of bhakti, that we must hear every single day. Or at least once a week when we gather here, we get to hear what's coming out from our hearts and connecting with each other. So hearing is a process which will actually create a pathway to find your true spiritual nature. And one of the sages, he explains the word Rit Karna Rasayana. These are three Sanskrit words that I'm using. Sanskrit is a language of the sages. So Rit means the heart, Karna means the ear, Rasayana, rasa means something that is very juicy, like mango, like peaches, for example. Rasayana. So when we hear from someone who has heard their whole life, what happens is your heart will drink the nectar or the juice of another one's heart through the heart, or so the ear of the heart. So that means what goes in will enter the ear of the heart and will drink the nectar of what is being poured into it. So this is what the sage explains, that it is the most powerful way to transform our consciousness. As I was explaining, through hearing, we can upgrade our consciousness or we can downgrade our consciousness. And it can be something so simple. Someone comes and whispers into your ear something really sweet, like, "Thank you so much for being such a kind, loving soul to your children," or to someone. Someone can just whisper that into your ears and your day is made. Because they have observed that, not just through their senses, but through their heart. And they came and they appreciated you. And they acknowledge and they explain to you what they observed. That alone can make your day. And that same hearing, if someone came and said something very unkind and not nice to you, then what happens? And our consciousness is gone haywire. We can't stay focused and we're trying to figure out, why did he or she say that? This is so bad. Am I really that bad? And we go spiraling down. So hearing is a very powerful tool for making sure that we hear the right thing is the real key, so that we can continue to upgrade our consciousness. Many of you know that science have been doing a lot of research with sounds. And I know that as a kid, we used to be given a plant and we used to chant mantras or sound poetry, Sanskrit poetry, to the plants. And we would gauge, the teachers would then gauge your level of consciousness by how the plant was growing. That means how clearly and lovingly you chanted the poetry and what kind of poetry you chanted would determine how the plants would grow. This is how our teachers used to try this on us. And we know, science is now researching that even the plants are receptive to the sound that they can hear. If we are unkind to the sound, to the trees or plants, then they will have one reaction. And if you are kind to the trees and plants, they have a different reaction. I know I love to garden, so in my front yard, I used to grow snow peas and I used to grow okra and different herbs. And every morning I would go and I would talk to them and I would tell them so many beautiful things. And I would literally go and talk to my trees, and people used to think I was a little crazy. But that's, everybody knows by now that I'm a little crazy. I like to talk to my plants. But the beautiful part of it was my little garden beds in my front yard was giving so much vegetables and so much tomatoes and okra that I couldn't eat. So I had to ask my neighbors, can you please come and pick all the okra you want, all the tomatoes and herbs you want? And they kept asking me, what kind of fertilizer are you putting into your plants? And I said, it's a secret fertilizer. I can't quite tell you. And they're like, come on, Veda, tell us what is it that makes your plants grow more than the plants in our yard? And I explained to them that I'm crazy that I talk to my plants. And that's my secret fertilizer. I go out in the morning and evening and I speak to them. And they were laughing. They were engineering students. So they were then thinking, yes. And it's funny because years later, they came and sent me some research papers of science using sound frequencies to grow plants. In different tribal cultures, they also use this art of speaking to trees and plants. When they want to cut down a tree, they actually ask the tree, hey, I really need you. I need to build a house with you. Is there any way you can, and they ask permission of the trees. Just like when I was young, when we used to go pick flowers for our worship, for our meditation in the morning, we chant mantras, poetry to the plants, asking them, hey, beautiful plant, you have amazing flowers and blah, 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 blah. And we just are going to pick a few of your beauty and offer it to the personification of beauty, because we worship divine nature in the form of Tulasi Devi in this powerful spiritual mountain called Giriraj. And we would then pay respects to the plants and then pluck the flowers. So it was like this whole relationship of communication that is a big part of our spiritual practice, is to communicate. And so this hearing is a big part of how our world reality manifests. Whatever we listen to is what we're going to become in our lives. If we continuously hear people being unkind, that vibration will then affect our existence so much so that, eventually we may even vibrate at that same frequency. And so therefore in yoga, this principle of what you hear is what you become. That becomes your reality. So we have to be very, very, very careful and diligent in what we hear and be very selective. So now in the yoga text, we also understand that hearing has to be from a proper source or a right source. Very, very important part. What does that right source mean? When we don't know who our Father is, the best authority on who can give us the right answer is our mother. The mother would know who our Father is. So, similarly, these wisdom texts, which are uh, considered spiritual knowledge, spiritual wisdom, is considered to be our mother. And that is where we need to hear from. And there is a whole process of vetting to make sure that we are hearing proper spiritual wisdom. The way we know that we are hearing proper spiritual wisdom is there is a change in our consciousness when we hear someone speak to us. When we hear them speak, it changes our consciousness. Many of us listen to motivational speeches and we hear all this, fiery, passionate lectures on how we can achieve anything we want and be whoever we want and whatever we want and how we can conquer the world. But somehow that speaks to our mind. And it's okay, it's good if it works. But in wisdom text, we understand that the real hearing is when someone is speaking to our heart. When they're speaking and they're touching our heart, and we allow those hearing to stimulate deep thought and try to make sense of it and turn it into a process of listening. And then our realities will start to shift. And then we know that the source we're hearing from is proper and correct. So that is one. And another few ways to vet if our hearing is proper, we try to make sure that everything we hear comes in something called a disciplic succession. Disciplic succession means that we must have heard it pure with our pure heart from a pure-hearted teacher. Like, for example, when a mother speaks, like I saw Robin and Doug speaking to their kids. If you heard them speak to their kids, you would know that they were not just using words. They were speaking from their hearts, and the kids were completely absorbing whatever instructions they were giving them. They were just like, yes, mom. And it was just loving communication of the hearts was taking place because the intention of the mother is pure. And the heart is, and the children were receiving that pure loving commands from the mother. So similarly, in our wisdom text, we see when a teacher speaks from his heart and we let those words and the sound frequency enter our heart, then we will notice there is a transformation. So it is the purity of the heart, and that information, it comes from a disciplic succession. That means we learn from our teachers. We capture the heart of our teachers and we hold it in our heart. And then we disseminate and we share that wisdom and that spiritual vibrations with those who we are serving as teachers. So this is a very important second process, that it has to be coming from an authentic source of purity. That's why in Bhagavad Gita, when we read the wisdom text, it explains that very important, whatever we hear, that it is properly authenticated. Just like there is a GPS system, if you want to drop some packages, you want to go to a destination, you put it in your on your maps, and your car you drive and you go to that direction. Similarly, in our spiritual practices, we have the GSS system, which is Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, which means a teacher a teacher whose heart is open, beaming with spiritual love. So that is a guru. Sadhu is our peers that we are all practicing together, someone who is on the same path with you, practicing, cultivating this bhakti, this unconditional love in the heart. And Shastra is the wisdom text. Wisdom texts are also written to serve others as an offering of their heart to the world. So those are called Shastras. So GSS means guru, means that teacher. Sadhu means our peers, and Shastra is the wisdom texts, which are basically spiritual ecstasies of teachers. When we are not able to hear and capture the ecstasy, the spiritual love of the teacher in their heart, then they write these books, and then you can read them later on and feel their spiritual love through their writings. And that's the reason we also read the wisdom texts. So this is my meditation for the week, how hearing turns into listening. But the first point is to hear, and how to properly select hearing, and how to let it enter our hearts and let it open the pathway to our divine self. So that's my share for the week. Any questions, comments, or reflections? We have 10 minutes. Yes, Amelie.
Hi, Vida. Thank you for this beautiful class. I was wondering, how do you know that you have someone with a pure heart in front of you? How do you know that you are hearing the good person?
Yes, very, very, very great question, Amelie. Amelie, when I met her, she would only speak French because she's French. And after, I guess, hearing me day after day, year after year, now she speaks to me in English, and it's so sweet to hear her speak in English. So it's another thing you can learn from hearing. You can learn another language. And it's funny, I can almost understand French because I hear French all the time, once a week at least. So, beautiful question, Amelie. The way to know that your teacher is speaking, I think, I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. That the teacher, how do you know who's the right teacher to hear from?
Yeah. How
Yeah.
do you know? How do you know that the person that teaches you has a pure heart? This is a
Yes.
good.
Yes. Beautiful, beautiful. One of the qualities of someone that you can hear is they will hear you. Every teacher, they are happy inside. They don't need to talk. And only when you approach them, then they open up the doors to their heart and they share what's in their heart. So most teachers are generally listeners, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to understand where your heart is so that they can have compassion for you and see how to help and support you. That is one of the qualities you'll notice in a teacher, that you can hear, that they actually hear you and you'll feel it in your heart. Many times people will speak and it'll stick in your mind and you'll keep them there. And there are people that speak will enter your heart and you'll keep them in your heart. The language of the hearts is not something that can be controlled and manipulated and navigated by the mind, because the mind will speak to another mind. and the intelligence will speak to another intelligence. But only a heart will speak to another heart. So that's how you know that you have a teacher who is someone you can hear. But we also have to, as students, we have to also, because as a student myself, you know, when I hear, it's very important that the wisdom text also explains these three principles of hearing properly. One is this three word in Sanskrit, pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. That means we must submissively inquire, humbly approach, and render service. When you apply these three principles, then we are the right student to actually hear. We cannot just think, I can do whatever I want and the teacher should touch my heart. Yes, that's also there. But if we really want to have that heart connection, then we need to at least try these three principles. Because you may remember, you can also examine yourself. When someone is speaking to you, what is it that you're doing? Sometimes you'll be surprised. You're in a group and everyone is speaking. You're listening, you're hearing what they're saying, but you're hearing with an idea, with the intent to prove them wrong, that you know something better than them. Or you're hearing with them with a critical ear. Oh, this person is just complaining about this and that. They're just talking nonsense. And then also you can hear people. There is something called appreciative hearing. You hear people and your heart, you appreciate them. And then there is active hearing. As I'm speaking and putting everyone to sleep, some of you may be actively hearing what I'm saying. You're thinking what I'm saying. So it's going a little deeper. And then there is also something called selective hearing. Selective hearing is, I like what he's saying. I'll listen to the part that I like. And whatever the part I don't like, I'll just block it off and take my mind somewhere else. So there's various different kinds of hearings that we have as students. So we have to also determine and examine ourselves. What kind of hearing am I doing? It's not just one way, just pouring in. It helps when there's the student has an open heart to, actively hear. Then the heart's open more. Does that make any sense, Emily?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone wants to help me out and add anything more to it? Or any more questions or doubts or any reflections anyone wants to share? Yes, Roberto. I love Roberto because he has a reservoir of questions. And that's the beauty that he carries in his heart.
But this time is not questions, it's more a something that I was reflecting. And it's very funny because this whole week I've been reflecting about hearing and listening. And now, this your teaching was about that. So I was very happy about that. But my realization is most times we go through life demanding ourselves to listen, and the way I understand listen is when you hear something and you're able to understand it, or you're able to understand it. But sometimes we need to give ourselves some time to hear. And what I get from your teachings is that hearing is a practice that you do continuously until you get to the point of listening. And once you listen, the way I understand it is when you're able to see with the eyes of the heart.
Beautiful.
Once you listen, you can understand and understand anything that you're going through and see it from different perspective and dimensions. But definitely the act of listening has to be something done continuously as a practice. And
Beautiful.
that's something that I take to myself, because most times I want to understand now, but there's a process. You cannot bypass the process.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. I will share. You ignited some more deeper realizations that I've been meditating on. Is many of the sages, they actually pray. They pray to God and say, God, please give me thousands of years and thousands of mouths, because the sages are always singing the glories of God and the divine and others. And they want to hear, because through thousands of years, they're drinking the nectar of the divine beauty that exists, the divine being. And it's so beautiful because it explains Shravanadi Suddha Chitte Karohe Udoy. It's another poetic Sanskrit term that explains that if you just hear, you will awaken the divine within your heart. Divine is not just waiting outside and not just in the churches and temples and synagogues and mosques. The divine is also within your heart. And simply through this hearing, Shravanadi, Suddha Chitta means with a pure heart. If you hear with a pure heart, then the divine will rise and appear within your heart. So if you're wondering, how do I make God appear in my life, you just hear with an open heart and from a right source, and he will appear in your heart. Beautiful. Thank you, Roberto. Anyone else would like to share anything? Brittany, you look like you wanted to share something. No. Okay. Okay. So thank you all so much. It is such a great honor to be with all of you. Please let us try to hear more and flood our hearts with the beaming purity of other loving souls on this planet. Keshav, you have any housekeeping announcements?